Good evening. I want to welcome all of you to the Compassionate Friends virtual event, Rising Together in Grief and Hope. We are so glad that you're here with us. We are going to have an evening of connection, care, and comfort while spending some time together. When I was thinking about our event tonight, a song kept running through my mind, Lean on Me by Bill Withers. I remember growing up and just loving this song. In fact, I can remember one of the first times I heard it. I was pretty young back then, maybe only about 7 years old. Even though I was young, this song has always had a lot of meaning to me. And just thinking about the words now, lean on me. Lean on me when you're not strong, and I'll be your friend. And I'll help you carry on. I'll help you carry on. Haven't we needed this, especially this past year? 2020 was a year filled with tremendous pain and sorrow and so many challenges. Gosh, just thinking about all of them, thinking about how long last year seemed. Just the sheer challenge of living in a COVID-19 world, and a world that we're still living through, where we're worried about ourselves, our family, our friends, and the unknown danger just outside the safety and comfort of our homes. In addition to worrying about our health, our society has lost its sense of normalcy. What used to be is no longer. All of this chronic uncertainty can take a toll on us physically, mentally, emotionally, in so many ways. And when you think about your own life, what are the ways you've been impacted? Along with our health concerns, there have also been economic concerns. Some of us have been affected financially. And even if we have not ourselves been affected personally, many of us have friends and family that we're worried about who have been affected. All of this totaled up can add enormous pressure in an already very stressful situation. When we consider and think about these changes, these stressors, really the enormity of them, how does this affect us when we're already grieving such devastating losses? How does this affect us when we're already in so much pain? Well, it can definitely make us more vulnerable. The changes also affect our ability to grieve and to focus on our own pain and loss. Grieving in the world that we're currently living in doesn't leave a whole lot of room for our own pain. And that's why having people around us who care about us and who are there for us is especially important. In fact, I can't think of a time in our lives when it's been more important. Thinking about people who help and support us, who we lean on. Have you ever noticed the people that show up in our lives when we're facing our worst possible time, when we're facing enormous pain, when we're facing one of our worst days? Sometimes these are people that we're expecting to show up. Maybe they're in our family, they might be our friends, even our coworkers. But sometimes the people that we thought would be there for us, the people that we thought would show up, simply haven't or simply can't. And that can really hurt. Others, maybe who we never met prior to our devastating pain and loss, show up and they're there. And they're ones that we never expected. And they are people who say, lean on me when you're not strong. And we are so grateful for them. If you are new to the Compassionate Friends, please know that we are here to help and we are here for you to lean on. We offer community and connection. At the Compassionate Friends, we offer support groups from hundreds of chapters across the United States, and we have extensive online support through private Facebook groups and our online chat. If you're not already a part of the Compassionate Friends, we'd love to have you join us. Because that is what we're all about. Leaning on each other and helping to carry each other when we're not strong. Please know that the Compassionate Friends is here for you, so you need not walk alone. Thank you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the evening, David Wood. David Wood is a corporate trial lawyer and devoted husband, father, and grandfather. After the shattering loss of his son Galen at age 29, he found there were few sources of support for bereaved parents in recovery. He also found that the 12-step model can be inadequate to meet their needs. David now writes and speaks to groups about the struggles of parents walking through the agony of out-of-order death, while at the same time coping with addiction in their families and in their own lives. Recently, David presented at the Compassionate Friends annual conference. His topic, for parents in recovery, staying sober after losing a child. Welcome, David.
My wife and I used to have a, shall we say, disagreement about the value of social greetings in our everyday lives. When someone asks her, "How are you?" she answers, "I'm great. How are you?" The answer is reflexive for her. She accepts a stranger's question, "How are you?" as an invitation to connect over some inconsequential transaction like picking up the dry cleaning. But that wasn't the way I rolled. I found it impossible not to take that question literally. I felt irritated to be asked a question that didn't call for a candid response. The waiter at the restaurant didn't really want to know how my day was going so far. He just needed me to tell him, "I'm great, how are you?" so he could get on with telling me about today's specials. Really, I wanted to say, in this day and age, we have to exchange wishes for each other's good health before I can order a plate of spaghetti? It seemed ridiculous, a holdover from another age when people greeted each other in the street with "Hail, fellow, well met," and that sort of thing. I mean, hadn't we evolved beyond that? So when a stranger asked me, "How are you?" I would usually growl, "I'm fine," and leave it at that. Rarely would I reciprocate by asking how he was this fine day. It just felt disingenuous to me. I didn't want to know, so I wasn't going to ask. If my wife were with me, she'd roll her eyes. The question's a convention, she'd remind me, not a request for information. The greetings are important. They show each other that we care about and respect each other. Couldn't I just suck it up and say, "I'm fine, how are you?" Well, we've been married a long time, so I knew what that meant. What she was really saying to me was, "You weren't raised by wolves, so grow up and act like a member of society." And so it was that, grudgingly and under pressure, I began to answer a stranger's question, "How are you?" with what seemed to me like an acceptable compromise. I'd say the obligatory, "I'm fine," but I wouldn't ask the fatuous counter question, "How are you?" Because really, I didn't care about the answer. Instead, and here comes the compromise, I would say, "I'm fine. I hope you are too." For me, this response checked all the boxes. Acknowledgement of the rhetorical question, "How are you?" Check. A responsive declaration of well-being that I may or may not actually feel? Check that too. An insincere expression of interest in the questioner's health? Again, check. Sounded like a win-win for everybody, right? But my wife would roll her eyes even more emphatically. "I wasn't playing by the rules," she would say. Saying, "I'm fine, hope you are too," leaves the questioner hanging, feeling awkward, unsure what to say next. How could I do that to somebody who was just trying to be nice to me? This seemed unfair. I mean, "I'm fine, hope you are too," seemed an acceptable response to a throwaway question, making the exchange of greetings between us short and sweet. At worst, I was abbreviating the interaction, freeing up the waiter or clerk to get on with selling me something. Wouldn't their supervisors approve? Well, that was usually where my wife would execute a final barrel roll of the eyes and pronounce me completely irredeemable. She began making it her business to spare the world from my being a curmudgeon. When we were in public together and a service person asked me how I was, she would cut in, and before I could say, "I'm fine, I hope you are too," she'd say with a dazzling smile, "I'm great, and how are you?" That worked fine for me. I got a pass on the social ritual. I didn't have to ask or answer any meaningless questions. And she got to prattle with the waitress over each other's healths. Again, a win-win for everyone. And then our son died, and my world imploded around me. Suddenly, I was hypersensitive, a bundle of nerves. Everything hurt, and I felt like I had no skin. Now, a stranger's question, "How are you?" sounded like fingernails on the blackboard to me. Saying I was just fine was a lie that I didn't feel like telling. When a grinning teenager at Starbucks asked me how I was doing, what I really wanted to say was, "Really, really awful. And how are you?" About a week after we lost our boy, I walked into a men's clothing store to buy a belt. A young man came bouncing up to me and asked me how my day was going. When I muttered, "Okay," he cranked his grin up a notch and said, "Just okay? Look outside. The day's beautiful. The world's green and the sky's blue. And how can you just be okay on a day like this?" I looked him square in the eye and I said, "I just need a belt to wear with the suit I'm going to wear to deliver my son's eulogy." Well, I was in and out of that store in just under 2 minutes, belt in hand. Just the way I like it, I thought. I don't do that anymore. In the 4 years since our son's death, I've come to realize that my wife's right. Asking each other how we are is an important way of how we achieve a community. Linguists and sociologists tell us that greetings play an essential role in our culture because they express a ritual form of politeness, an important way that we build and maintain social relationships. A greeting in Zimbabwe involves hand clapping. The Japanese exchange vows. The Maasai tribe in Kenya and Tanzania spit on each other. We ask each other how we are. As greeting rituals go, ours is pretty uncomplicated. As I've moved through the crushing grief that's come in the wake of losing our child, I see now that any connection I make with strangers around me, even one as banal as an exchange of greetings, could be the one that on any given day takes me out of my sadness for just a minute. Saying, "I'm fine, how are you?" could spare me a moment of heart sickness. But if, on the other hand, I say, "I'm fine, hope you are too," I end that exchange before its fruition, and I miss that moment of relief. Those moments add up, and I found I need every single one. I've also found out that out of the many strangers who've asked me since we lost our son how I am, every so often there's someone who completely unexpectedly wants a real answer. If I habitually respond with an exchange ending, "Fine, hope you are too," I can miss moments of extraordinary kindness from strangers I may encounter just once in my life journey. So I fly a lot for my business. And shortly after our boy's death, I was coming home on a plane on a Friday evening, exhausted after a long, hard week on the East Coast. As the flight got underway, a flight attendant came over and knelt next to my seat, introduced herself, and asked, "How are you?" As I was about to reply, I saw a shadow of concern cross her face, and I realized I had been sitting there crying. As I struggled to regain my composure, I choked out that one of my children had recently died. Looking straight into my eyes, she reached out and held my hand and squeezed just for a moment, then went on with her work. Had I responded to her question, "How are you?" with, "I'm fine, hope you are too," I might have missed that moment of connection, that gift of compassion that she gave me that got me through the next few agonizing hours. I think of that woman as an angel, and I'll be forever grateful for the comfort she gave me that day in a time of great darkness with just a squeeze of my hand. Since then, I've come to know that I'm surrounded by angels just like her. As my head's cleared in the wake of tragedy, I've encountered strangers who have shown me profound goodness when I least expected it, just because I opened my heart for just a second and answered the question, "How are you?" with something other than, "I'm fine, hope you are too." I've also learned to be an angel by watching for opportunities to comfort strangers. Not long ago, I was driving home in the town where I live when I was passed by a car going at top speed, swerving wildly. Now, I was on a two-lane street that had a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit, and I knew the way this guy was driving was really dangerous. As he roared off in front of me, he suddenly swerved into a driveway. Well, I assumed he was drunk, so I followed him, thinking I was going to tell him to stay off the road or I was going to call the cops. I pulled up next to the guy and I rolled down my window. What I saw was a young man, maybe 18 or 20, sobbing uncontrollably. My desire to tell him off instantly melted away because I saw something that I immediately recognized: the face of human suffering. I asked him, "How are you?" Through racking sobs, he told me that his father had recently been killed in an accident. I don't remember exactly what I said, only that I used soothing tones. And as he began to calm, I asked if this was where he lived. He said it was. I replied as gently as I knew how that he probably shouldn't be driving. The young man nodded and went inside. In retrospect, I think of this encounter as another of life's gifts to me: the opportunity to be an angel for the briefest of moments towards someone who is suffering terribly. Had I not known what terrible suffering feels like, I might not have recognized this opportunity. I might have lost this chance to try to comfort a stranger. That's how I try to repay the universe for the kindness that strangers have shown me. There are many of us walking through the pain, losing a child, a grandchild, a sibling, never coming out on the other side, but still moving toward a place where most of the time we can remember our loved ones without breaking down. When we're in the middle of these nightmares, it feels like the lights have gone out and are never coming back on. What's happened to us is the worst thing that can ever happen to a parent, a grandparent, a brother, or a sister. It just feels like the end. But it isn't. St. Francis of Assisi said, "All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the flame of a single candle." I know now that the darkness that drops on us in the wake of terrible tragedy will not last forever. And that one stranger in 10 or 100 or 1,000 who really wants to know how I am on any given day is a flicker of healing light. I now understand that no matter how bad things get, there are people out there we don't know who in brief encounters will listen to us and help us and support us right through the worst days of our lives. I've also come to know that every so often there will be a suffering stranger who wanders into my world just for a moment, needing me to ask, "How are you?" and listen to the answer. I guess I've grown up a little since my son's death. I get now that my wife was right. The ritual exchange of greetings with a stranger asks very little of me. All I have to do when someone asks me how I am is to keep an eye out for angels and speak my lines, which, as it turns out, are the truth most of the time. I'm okay. It's been really hard and unimaginably painful, and sometimes it's still that way. But right now, at this moment, I'm right where I'm supposed to be, here with you, sharing in the spirit of mutual friendship and support, asking one another with open, loving hearts how we are. How am I? I'm fine. I hope you are too.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker is Sherry O'Loughlin. Sherry O'Loughlin is the Chief Executive Officer for the Compassionate Friends. Sherry came to know TCF's life-saving support 8 years ago after the sudden death of her beloved 14-year-old son, Connor. Prior to joining TCF, she was the Executive Director of the Children's Grief Center of New Mexico and spent over 25 years in executive leadership roles within the business and entrepreneurial sectors. Sherry published the book Life from the Ashes, Finding Signs of Hope After Loss, and is both a bereaved parent and a bereaved sibling from her youth. She has an MBA and is a certified leadership coach and business consultant. She is a speaker on loss, grief, and the healing journey, and has been a national workshop presenter for TCF. Sherry was named a Forbes Western Women Business Leader, a New Mexico Women of Influence Award recipient, and is a proud mom of 2 loving young adult daughters. Welcome, Sherry.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm glad we can be gathering together virtually tonight from all across the country and internationally. Pamela, thank you for that introduction. The topics of grief and hope can seem like opposites. How is there hope when we're grieving? Yet the Compassionate Friends has always been a model of how these two intertwine and weave together after loss. The Compassionate Friends is a place for bereaved parents, grandparents, and siblings to grieve their most painful losses with others who share them, while looking to those who have been bereaved longer to find grains of hope for the future. I started my role with the Compassionate Friends the week of March 16th, 2020, and what a week to start. This was also the week our country was shutting down, bringing swift, unexpected changes for all of us. And our reality was a stark difference from what it had just been weeks before. As I was transitioning from my previous role and envisioning how my first few weeks would be, it all completely changed in a matter of days from the new circumstances I found myself in. What a reminder this was of grief and loss. Loss is often sudden and unexpected. It changes our assumptions, control, and the sense of security we enjoyed just a short time before we lost. As for many of us, the rapid shifts we went through last spring and continued throughout the year took me back to the significant losses in my life that produced similar feelings, but on a much more painful level. When I was just a child, my younger sister Patty died while we were on a family vacation, in an instant changing my family's life forever. The life I knew and all I could count on no longer existed, and tremendous pain enveloped us for a long time. No one could explain to me at 9 years old how this was possible. All I wanted to know was when she would come back again and when things would be back to normal and like how they used to be. As a mother decades later, I was thrust back into this horrible place when my beloved son Connor was killed in an accident when he was only 14. One minute my life with our 3 children was beautiful and what I loved, and the next it was a nightmare. Things I never could have imagined needed to be done in the weeks and months to follow. It felt physically like a punch in the gut that knocked the wind out of me constantly throughout the day. The fog I was in meant that I couldn't process even the simplest of things, and my heart was crushed in a way that I never thought could physically be possible. I couldn't imagine ever seeing light again. Numerous times in my life, I have needed to reconcile the life we can suddenly find we have versus the life we knew and loved that seemed to just disappear. 2020 was a year like this for a lot of people in our country and across the world. For some, this was their first experience of significant loss, and for others, earlier loss and grief were newly triggered by changes. Losses of many kinds were present this last year, some of the most tragic being deaths of those we love dearly. Additional losses included severe financial, job, and business loss, health loss for others, and being denied the opportunity to be by the sides of loved ones who were passing away. Even for people who have not been impacted by these tragic losses of life, there were losses of school, job, and once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, rituals, internships, traditions, travel, celebrations, and certainly our sense of safety, control, and security. It's no wonder that most people were grateful to see 2020 put behind us and a new year and new beginning emerge. And now, here we are in 2021. So what does that really mean? We've made progress, vaccinations have begun, and this moves us forward in our hopes that the pandemic will eventually be behind us. Yet we have a long way to go before anything will resemble a freer life and sense of being that we remember and long for. We are in a new stage of the pandemic and the social issues in our country that have accompanied them. Yet the old stage isn't over. It's really in between. It's a continuation with just some modifications of how it felt last year. This reminds me of our grief journeys following tragic loss. There are parallels of this moment and its experience with our longer-term grief paths. Loss of control continues for us and it's not ended. Most of us feel just done with it and we want to do what we used to do. We want it to change faster than it can, and our weariness can be heavy. Support in some ways is quieter than it was last year. In the first part of the pandemic, media shared stories all around us, encouraging our efforts to stay positive, showing us what others on the other side of the world were doing to socially distance and stay positive, reminding us that we will get through this together and highlighting appropriate support for our heroes. These are still around, but they seem a little less frequent, and they have been competing with stories of the heavy social challenges we face outside of the pandemic. The hopeful stories we hear, we still appreciate and value, but we've gotten a little used to them and may be looking for something new to infuse us. Our pains are recognized a little less by others if we have lost. Sometimes in our grief, people on the outside are finished with their capacity to support us over the long haul, long before we're done needing it. And we're seeing this with grief and around the changes this past year. At the same time, this forced quiet time we've had for almost a year now also facilitates changes within us that can strengthen our journey through this time and provide the seeds of new things. We can find new growth and perspectives we might not have found if we weren't forced to. Our time with children and family is appreciated in different ways than we may have been able to before, even if sometimes it can feel like a little bit too much time together all at once right now. There's been a resurgence of simpler pleasures and connection opportunities like picnics, games, walking, nature, and having phone calls that are not so rushed. We've included people in our celebrations through virtual ways who would have been left out before simply because of distance. Many families have created new rituals that help them stay connected with a regular Zoom or Skype call, when before they just waited until the next holiday that they could take a trip and be together. And many plan to continue those long after the pandemic is gone. Some have made new decisions about finances and what's important, reevaluating what they once thought they couldn't live without and enjoying new things that surprise them. Others have made plans for the future that take time, quiet, and thoughtfulness, not available with our hectic-paced lifestyles we knew just a short time ago. People have made decisions about where they want to live, their families, jobs, relationships, and values. Greater clarity has emerged for many around the lifestyles we want to invest time into creating and how we go about doing that. There seems to be a little more collective tolerance for our bringing our whole selves into our everyday lives with our virtual meeting and work from home environments. We've seen more of people's living rooms, pets, and children who accidentally pop on screen that help humanize our organizations, and we find we can still be very productive and effective in our work even when this happens. While working from home has its challenges and limitations, people also are enjoying more time in their homes they've worked hard for, that before sat empty much of the day with a full work week, school week, and commute. Collective thinking and generosity has also grown as our human challenges have more in common nationwide and worldwide. Nonprofit organizations and service industries are meeting the needs of a wider group of people because people are being met where they are right now and with more creative and flexible solutions that are more efficient. So, how do we continue through more of the same in 2021, even with these positives we've identified? When we think about this time period that can seem grueling with each new day that does not feel new, what are steps that can see us through when weariness continues? First, start by taking each day one step at a time. Some of the first questions asked at a support group of the Compassionate Friends often are, how will this ever be bearable? How will I ever make it through this? Will this ever get better? I remember asking these questions, and one of the responses at my first meeting that was really important to me was to take things 1 hour at a time, then one day at a time, then 1 week at a time, a month at a time, and so on. This was some of the best advice I could recall and can be particularly helpful for those of you who are newly bereaved. For me at that time, making it from 1 hour to the next was a big task to attempt and a big challenge each new day that I tried it. We can use a similar approach to answer the question of how we get through this time period that we're sick of, that has no certain end, and that includes many unbearable days. It feels overwhelming and impossible to think about what things will be like a year from now. How will we recover from the things that were missed that we can't get back? And what will it look like 5 years from now? And how will those things impact my life and my family? Rather than go that far, starting with how things can be managed on a day-to-day basis is what we can control now and what can keep them manageable for this time. Second, being present and staying mindful of the simplest things helps us appreciate our days more. Experiences such as the smell of fresh brewed coffee in the morning, the way a song changes our feelings or shifts our energy, the way a fresh breeze or even the cold wind feels on our skin, the fun of watching a puppy frolic at the park, or the sounds of a child's belly laugh. These all make a day more meaningful and more valuable. Third, helping someone else is one of the best ways that we can help ourselves. Big volunteer initiatives are great, and there are ways to engage in those even now. Small acts of kindness, though, are also wonderful ways to move ourselves through these days. My son Connor was a very giving person and very connected with nature. He knew more and cared more about recycling and aquifers and the desert climate we live in and taking care of our people and planet than people 2 or 3 times his age. Some friends of ours started a wonderful tradition on each of his birthdays to honor these unique traits he had on a day that we all know can be so painful as we're recognizing these days that follow without them. We would set out to do random acts of kindness equal to the age he would have turned that year. So, for example, 18 of them on his 18th birthday, or 21 of them on his 21st birthday. Extra difficult marking years for me. These could be anything from paying for the person's lunch who came behind you in a drive-through, excuse me, taking a couple dozen bagels with cream cheese to a first responders unit, putting flowers at the cemetery for a friend who no longer lived in that town to visit her child, or making cookies for a neighbor. It was special because it started out with just a few people, and they decided to post some of these on Facebook so we could all share. It grew amazingly to where people who had never met Connor and some who I had never met and were just Facebook friends with joined in to do this on his birthday. How special that was for our family to turn this energy around that was so hard on that day and start something so simple that made this world a better place in his honor. And how hungry many people were to willingly join in because an opportunity for something positive that took very little effort came across their posts. Next, practicing gratitude each day is something that can be very helpful. When I was entering the second year after Connor died, I was struggling with how I could face decades more of what felt like an eternity already, just having made it through the first year. I had practiced gratitude, but it can be a hard thing to remember or regularly embrace in deep and new grief. The more I practiced it, though, the more steps I could take forward, even if just tiny ones each day. Whether this is something you write down, say out loud, think in your head, or share with someone else, that doesn't matter. Whatever feels best to you is what can make a difference in how to get through this hard time. If your losses are substantial and someone precious to you died recently, this is a particularly helpful thing to do. If this time period has triggered grief from an earlier loss, or if you're grieving the losses presented by the last year of changes, gratitude can also help. Set 5 minutes a day if you can at the same time, and something new will begin to grow. I practice gratitude first thing when I wake up, before I get out of bed, and before I look at my phone. Because when I pick up my phone, I'll see what has already been placed into my day, whether it fits for me or not. Doing this frames the rest of what I see in my day after I've already created this important space so I can plan my day. Finally, plan small things to look forward to in the future. Know they may change numerous times, especially if they involve trips and travel, and have backup ideas of simple things that are possible right now to do instead. Choose one thing you might like to do differently in your life a year from now when the pandemic has ended, or we are at least on the home stretch of it. Working towards something big or small in who you want to become helps you see progress in a time that seems confining, limiting, and otherwise pretty stagnant. Transition is often much harder than where we were before it and where we end up. Our patience is tried, and we push back on the uncertainty and what we have grown weary from. We can stay with the focus of what was horrible and wanting to get back to before. And like grief, our before won't return, and our new will be a combination of some of the old and many of the new things we are defining in this moment. We can focus on what we can't control, what was highly disappointing and didn't work. Again, like grief, this won't change what's happening to us, and it really doesn't give us much to stand on and go forward from. What we can control is how we see what this experience is, how we feel about it, and to be open to the growth and learning of this period of time and how it changes and forms us. Like silent hands shaping and molding us from this experience of loss, we have an opportunity to identify the hopeful discoveries unfolding and what pieces we can take with us by choice when we're able to breathe out fully again. Post-traumatic growth, as this is called, changes us to a new version of ourselves than we could have imagined if we allow it to. When I think of my tragic losses, growing these new types of seeds of myself allowed me to make meaning of them as I continued to mourn and love. This is where the hope is. We can feel guilty sometimes in talking about growth, as if we don't love the person who died anymore, or we're telling others we don't love them as much, that we're over it, or that we're forgetting about them. But not at all. Our deepest forms of love and expression are through these new seeds of growth. As this time won't change and be finished as quickly as we like, let's frame our 2021 through this lens of growth and discovery for what we can take with us. When we think back to times of loss, it can be agonizing to remember what we went through and tempting to throw it all away and not want to revisit it. Thus, we hear a lot, 2020 was the lost year. But was it? If we do that, we lose what we learned and the growth that came from it. We're always a mixture of both the pain and the learning. It's tempting when I look back at the pain and losses in my life, especially going all the way back to childhood, to say that it was terrible and not want to think about it at all. But I would then lose all of it, including the good things and including what I take with me, what I gained and who I became because of it, in honor of my son and sister. In honor of them, I grow. They would never want to see otherwise. A wasted year, perhaps, but I would suggest not. If your loss has been tremendous this past year, I'm sorry you are in this very painful place right now that can feel like it will never end, and it can feel really awful and very dark. Try to find what you take forward new in honor of your loved one that you lost and in honor of their life and their passing. Thinking back on 2020, what is one way that you may have found a new appreciation for life? No longer fear as much, have greater empathy or identified a new strength? Or what is a way you connect better with others or have something new awakened in you from what stopped last year? We learn so much from grief and loss, even when they're the most painful lessons and ones we would give back in a heartbeat if we could. Since we cannot, we can see what new windows they allow us to look through and what cracks of light they provide. So what can you take forward into 2021 in honor of your loss And what can you take forward through 2021 in honor of who you are becoming from your experiences of loss? Each of us has the opportunity to explore these questions, and everyone's discoveries will be different. This has always helped me to find new ground to stand on when there seemed to be none left. Thank you for listening and sharing this time with me today. I wish you greater peace and safety as 2021 unfolds.
Thank you, Sherry. Our last speaker of the evening is David Kessler. After David is finished speaking, we'll all come back together with a Q&A panel that will include all of tonight's speakers. David Kessler is one of the world's foremost experts on death and grief. He is the author of 6 books, including the new best-selling book, Finding Meaning, The Sixth Stage of Grief. He co-authored 2 books with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and his first book, The Needs of the Dying, is often the #1 hospice book in the US, and it received praise from Mother Teresa. David has taught physicians, nurses, counselors, police, and first responders about end-of-life, trauma, and grief. However, despite his vast knowledge of grief, his life was turned upside down by the sudden death of his 21-year-old son. It moved him to write his newest book, Finding Meaning. He is the founder of Grief.com, which has over 5 million visits yearly from 167 countries. Welcome, David.
Hey everybody, I'm so glad to be here with you this evening. It's special in a lot of ways. Today's my birthday, and I was in my Tender Hearts group, and now I'm in this group. And you know, I thought about now in my 60s, hit those 60s, and I think birthdays have different meanings. Certainly after a child has died. I know I was all about celebrating my children's birthdays and making sure that they knew just how special they were to be born. And I remember my kids saying to me once, well, what about your birthday? Isn't it special that you were born? And we have these birthdays when one of them is gone. So it's a mixture. That's why my motto is what would be meaningful. And meaningful to me is to be in my Tender Hearts group and then be in here with you, with my Compassionate Friends family. So that's where I am tonight, and I'm glad to be with you. So many of you may know me, some may not. My name's David Kessler, as you heard. And, I chose this world as a profession. And I chose it only because it had come to me first. When I was 13, my mother was dying. There was a mass shooting at the time, and one of the first mass shootings in the US. And it changed the trajectory of my life and put me on this road of helping people deal with grief and loss and walk beside them and learn from them. And I've been honored to learn from thousands and thousands of people who have had horrendous grief in their life, and been privileged to work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and write a couple of books, Louise Hay. And after all that time in this field, a few years ago, my younger son, David, unexpectedly died. And it was brutal. Don't have to tell you how brutal it is. And I actually thought about, I wanted to write every parent I had counseled a note saying, as a grief professional, I had no idea how bad it was. And I'm so sorry for your pain. It was challenging to try to figure out how to go forward with life, as all of you are figuring out how to do. And I had to really decide all those things I've been telling folks as a grief specialist. Go to grief counseling, go to a group. does that mean me? Am I supposed to practice what I preach? And I did. And I went to a counselor, and I went to compassionate friends groups. And I didn't wear my contacts. I wore my glasses and a baseball cap. And I sat in groups 4 and 5 feet from tables with my books on it. And I couldn't tell anyone that was me because I couldn't hide and be the grief specialist. I had to be the father who had to bury a son. That's where my healing would lie. And so here we are in 2021, and we're living in a world that got a big shot of hope with the vaccines coming out. And it was like a new year. We've left 2020 behind. And I thought it was so fascinating how people had this magic sense of December 31st, the bad goes away. January 1st, we're happy again. And then there's like this sadness that came over people when they realized the virus is still here. The economy, the businesses, the job losses, the world we knew a year ago is gone forever. Grief's isolating in a normal world, even more isolating now. But I thought it was so interesting how they thought something would magically happen at the end of the year. We've all dealt with this. People around us think that something magically happens to us at day 365, and a year's gone by and we're magically over our grief. And we have to tell them that we don't get over our grief. We don't move on from our grief. Our children weren't a cold or a flu that we get over, right? We learn to live with this loss. And so we know that calendars have nothing to do with what you were feeling. So I've been around so much of the sort of sadness that's happening of like, oh my gosh, I thought everything was going to be better, and yet it's not. And so one of the things that I think we're so good at is holding hope for one another. You know, when a child has died, it's a pretty hopeless experience. And I can remember walking into those compassionate friends rooms and seeing someone who was there 10 years and 25 years and going, oh no, am I going to be sitting here in pain in those years? And then I realized they're the elders who are there to help. And so we've learned how to hold hope for one another. You know, I tell people, when you feel hopeless, I will hold hope out for you. I have hope for you. And that's what we do for one another. And I think in 2021, it's important we hold hope for each other, that we keep that hope, knowing just like those elders, we are going to find some peace with this virus, with this economy, and with our losses. And it doesn't magically happen when the year changes or anything to do with the calendar. It has to do with us, right? So I was, after going to those meetings, I had, many of you know, I worked with Kubler-Ross on the stages, and we wrote a couple of books about it. We always said they're not linear. They're not a map for grief. There's no one right way to do grief. But I can tell you, with my own son, my younger son dying, when I started feeling like I'm going to have to find a way to accept this loss, acceptance was not enough. I needed more. I needed meaning. And I wrote a book about my experience. And oh my gosh, in some ways it could be the Compassionate Friends book, because I interviewed so many parents who had had children. They had found meaning after their children had died, after a child was murdered, after a child had addiction, after a child died by suicide, after a child died by illness. I also interviewed people who had a spouse die or a parent die. and learned this concept of how meaning is possible. And one of the things that I think Compassionate Friends did is they asked me if I would speak at the conference 2 years from now. At the time, they said the first year you should come as a father. So I went to the Compassionate Friends National Conference as a father, not the expert, not the guy who was writing the book, but as a father. And Kathy, who many of you know, was just so wonderful to me and was sort of my guide through all of that. And then I came back the next year and talked about my work in finding meaning. And when I think about this concept of meaning, and meaning is about partly that hope, the purpose, our lives. One of the things that people often hear when they go, you wrote a book called Finding Meaning, there's no meaning in a child's death. And I'll go, no, of course there isn't. Meaning is in us. Meaning is what we do afterwards. Meaning is how we honor their life, how we honor the time we had with them. Meaning doesn't take away the pain. It's a cushion to the pain. It can be a lot of things, it can be finding gratitude in time. That gratitude takes so long. But I'll tell you, people would ask me, oh, have you found any gratitude about your son dying? And I would say, actually, I have. Because the one worse thing I can think of than my son dying would be never getting to meet him this lifetime. To come here on earth and not get to know my son David would have been a far more horrible tragedy. So I'm not grateful he died, but I am grateful I had him. And so many of you taught me how to do that. Meaning can also be finding a way to commemorate those who have died. Meaning can be realizing the brevity of life. Let us not waste it. That this time is not guaranteed for us, for our children, for our family members. It can be realized we're changed by their life, by who they were. We can be changed by their death. Maybe we want to create something for others so that other children don't die that way. Maybe we want to make the world safer. I think these days in the pandemic, we could be such teachers because there's so much destination addiction. When the year comes, when the vaccine comes, then it's all going to be right. It'll be perfect again, right? Destination addiction. Let me get to the goal and then everything's perfect. We've realized there's no end in grief. There's no goal to get to. And I think about that in this pandemic, about how, it's about learning to live with this. And it is disappointing that now there's variants that might be out there. And to remind people, there isn't a magic moment coming for grief, the pandemic, or anything. We're going to learn to live with this new and different world. But it can still be a world worth living in. And there's so much uncertainty. And, when there's uncertainty, I know I become more controlling. And gosh, I was a controlling parent, and with all my control, my son still died. So you sort of realize you can try to control, but life has an uncertainty all its own that we have to make peace with it. And all of us have been taught the hard way. So, I think about with the pandemic, what's in our control? Doing things to keep safe. And after that, realizing fear doesn't stop death, fear stops life. And we can find a way in this to continue our life, to honor our children, to move forward for those who are still alive around us that still need our love and care. I think about, I'm a bit of a teacher at heart. So I think about a number of elements that we all go through in life that really connect through to grief and compassionate friends and what we're dealing with in this pandemic and with our children's death. And I think often in grief, there's 6 elements that we have to deal with. And they're what help us grieve in a way that in time will help us get to more love than pain for those who have died. And they're community, continued connections, knowing our grief doesn't define us, treating ourselves as our best friend, not comparing, and counting our wins. So when I think about community, look how we're gathering. We couldn't gather for the conference. We're gathering here. We're learning to gather virtually. People in grief need other people in grief, because the reality is sometimes our friends and family who we think should of course get our loss are the very people that want us to move on or get over it. And I always say, we have to really find the community that helps us and understands us. And that's true with grief, and it's true with compassionate friends. Years ago in psychology, there was almost this thought that when someone dies, you complete the relationship and you find closure. I do not believe in closure. I don't think we close that door on our children. I find that, and now we're seeing this in psychology, that we need continued connections. Death, I'm like, don't give death any more power than it has. Death has the power to physically take our child. It doesn't have the power to end a relationship. It doesn't have the power to end our love. And so I'm always going to love my son. I'm always going to feel connected to my son. There is no closure that I'm looking for. I am absolutely connected to him and plan to stay that way. The other element is that our grief doesn't define us. People want to define us. You're crying too much. You're not crying enough. You should get over it. You should move on. And I always think what you think of my grief is just none of my business. This is about me and my child. And I do it the way I will. I can remember when I first began doing lectures again, after my son died, there was a brochure that went out with me of a picture, and I was smiling, and we got a few emails from people like, oh my goodness, you have this, David Kessler's teaching this grief course, and he's had these horrible griefs in his life, and he's a grief specialist, he shouldn't be smiling. And I happen to know his child died, and he should not be grinning on that brochure. And I first thought, well, do you want your grief specialist looking like they're at the edge too, or looking funereal? And 2, you don't know me. You don't know my son, David. My son, David, loved my smile. I smile in honor of my son. There is no disloyalty in me smiling. Every smile I have. So what people think of you and your grief is just none of your business. They don't know. They haven't walked a mile in your shoe. And sometimes the next element is we need to treat ourselves as our best friend. That's why it's so important. I love having my Tender Heart group and compassionate friends. Group work is amazing. I can tell someone, don't blame yourself. And they're like, yes, but. In a group, you see someone else blaming themselves the way you are. And you're like, don't do that to yourself. And you're like, oh, but I do that to myself too. So in grief work, we find ourselves in each other's stories, and we find healing in each other's stories. And the next element is compare. So treat yourself well. Remind yourself to be as compassionate to yourself as you are to that other parent. And then the next element is not comparing. We've learned, it doesn't matter whether your child lived for 5 minutes or your child lived for 20 years or your child lived to 50 years. they're your child, or that miscarriage mattered. You know, this idea that somehow there's better and worse degrees of children dying is just a crazy thing. And we've learned not to compare. And the last element I think helps us all is this idea of you can't, like I said, you can't get to gratitude right away. That takes a long time. But we can count our wins. You know, showing up today for you here is a win. It's taking care of yourself. It's honoring your grief. It's dedicating some time. You showering sometimes in grief is like a lot. You walking the dog, feeding your other kids, you know, dealing with your husband, your wife, showing up at work, those are wins. And sometimes before gratitude, we just have to get to wins. And so I think to remember some of these basics that makes me feel so grateful for all of you and for other people who have had losses. I'll tell you the one thing as a grief specialist that has helped me for years with my own son dying is that for decades I taught classes, and people like you and parents from Compassionate Friends and chapter leaders would show up at my lectures and be there to learn to help more, so that when my son died, in my darkest moments, I thought about all of you and how you managed to still show up, and you were my light. So that's what makes it an honor for me to be here with you tonight on my birthday. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. Thanks.
Well, thank you to all of the wonderful speakers for your heartfelt words and your encouragement. We will be bringing everyone back together in just a moment and have a question and answer. I'm Pamela Gabay, and I work with the Compassionate Friends on special projects. And I am serving in honor and memory of our daughter, Megan, and also my brother, Jerry, and my sister, Donna. We are so glad that all of you are here with us tonight to be able to take part in this event. We have people here from across the United States and at least 10 other countries, including England, South Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and the Bahamas. After the conclusion of this event, if you'd like to learn more about the Compassionate Friends programs or how to support us, you can visit our website at compassionatefriends.org. We've had quite a few questions about whether or not this would be recorded, and it will be available this weekend. Now I'd like to invite all of the speakers to join us on camera. Looks like you already have, which is great. Let's see. Thank you, David Wood, David Kessler, and Sherry O'Loughlin. We have had quite a few questions tonight already, and then we had some questions that were sent in prior to the event. If we could actually go ahead and just start, and this can be for anybody here on the panel. David Kessler, you mentioned about how people judge us in our grief, and you spoke a little bit about that. I'm wondering if David Wood or Sherry would like to talk a little bit about us being judged in our grief and what that's like.
Sure,
Sherry? How about you go first and I'll follow up.
That sounds fine. I would agree with what David said. It's so interesting because everybody grieves so differently. And initially, after I lost my son, I had a lot of people say, this would happen, I would do this, I would say this. And some of it was true and some of it was not. And so immediately it made me feel like, okay, not only did I lose my son, but now I'm not even grieving right. I can't even get this right because they're doing it this way and they're telling me it's supposed to be like that. And it took a long time to really realize it just is very different. And it differs based on your gender, based on your ethnic, racial, cultural background, based on where you live in the United States, the size of your family, religion, outside of the United States. And so I think one of the things I've learned in my grief, especially over decades, having come from a bereaved family, is that we can learn from other people's ways that they manage their grief, and we can be better at our own grief if we're open to that, and try very hard not to ever tell someone they should or shouldn't be doing it. They should cry more, they should cry less, they should speak more about it, they should speak less about it. And anytime I meet somebody newly bereaved and I see that sort of coming up, I just try to offer that wherever they are right now is exactly where they need to be, and that they shouldn't be worrying about what anybody else says or does, and just walk those moments because their heart, their soul, their spirit knows what they need at that moment.
I find that when someone has said to me something like, you're still feeling horrible grief? You're still crying every day? I mean, can't you just kind of make it a good day? Somebody said that to me once. It's like, whoa, why didn't I think of that? But what really, it's incredibly irritating and hurtful. But what I've found, and actually tomorrow is our son's death anniversary, so this is a very emotional time of the year for me. But it's also a time where I realize that those around me who say things like that are really struggling with their own fears of going through this kind of ordeal that we all have been through. They're dealing with their own. They're dealing with the emotions that my pain provokes in them, and as a result, I have to find a way to be compassionate toward them, because if I don't, I just get mad, and that doesn't help me or them. David couldn't, I couldn't put it any better than David did. Looking for meaning is a higher form of searching, at least for me, than just looking for acceptance. Acceptance, I need more than that. And if I can't sort of find an open heart, be able to have an open heart toward people who say thoughtless things to me without meaning to hurt, but because they're struggling with their own issues, then I think I'm losing an opportunity for insight and growth.
Thank you. And there's a question about, and this is for anyone who would like to answer it, for people in grief who do not want to join a group or to speak with a counselor, are there some recommendations that you have? David Kessler, would you like to start with that one?
I think it goes back to we all grieve differently. I mean, people who are introverts are still going to be introverts. I mean, for some people, reading a book is the way. We have this thought that everyone should see a counselor, everyone should go to a group, and that's just not how everyone grieves. And so I think it's so important to, one, not equate if they're not grieving like us. It usually isn't about love. Sometimes we think, oh, didn't they love them as much? They should be hurting the way I am and seeing a counselor like me. But, our loved ones do it all differently. Some of us, I've been doing so many videos. Some people like to just watch a video. That might be their style. Others, it might be, when the pandemic's over at the pool hall with your friends. That might be the way you grieve. And there's no right or wrong to it. I think it's for each of us to pick our resources.
Would anybody else like to comment on that?
I would agree with everything David said, and I would just add other ways for those who are not, for whom it's not as natural to be in a group or a counselor. Also movies. There's movies about loss. I know I watched some of them. That was just exactly what I needed. It took my heart to a place that allowed some expression that I couldn't do on my own. Writing is so effective for some people, whether it's poetry or prose or other things, and it can be really useful down the road when you look back at who you were 5 years later, 10 years later. So in addition to what David said, I think there are really multiple ways to do that. Music, songs, there's a lot out there. I know I had a playlist on my iPod that were songs about losing my child. And there were just times where that was my expression rather than talking to somebody in a group or counseling. So I think those are all methods that can help people who may not be as comfortable in a group setting, or that's just not their way.
And I think that's so true that for some people it might be nature. For some people it might be art. And it's interesting, I learned this with compassionate friends, as I mentioned. You know, if you've seen one group, you've seen one group. Maybe that group didn't resonate, there's a different group. We all do it different ways. In my Tender Hearts group, we're like having Sunday afternoon at the movies and going to watch a movie together this weekend. And it's interesting how people think, oh, if I go to that group, if I do that, they picture their worst version of it, but it might not be that way. And one of the things I want to say that I found in my research, I found so fascinating. People want to show us comedies. And the reality is dramas are better for us. We identify with dramas. We don't want to be cheered up.
Or sad movies.
Right, right.
You know, I was one of those people who just didn't, for whom groups in the first year or two just didn't resonate for me. It just, I found I wasn't able to contribute very much. And for me, it was writing. I found that writing and what was my primary way of processing early on, when it felt like I was just moving through molasses, when everything was slow, when everything hurt, as I mentioned in my talk. Writing was the lubricant that sort of got me through the first year or two.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm reading through the comments, and one of the things that I'm seeing mentioned more than once is feelings of guilt and how you cope when your child, grandchild, brother or sister or loved one has died. What are some of the ways, whether you're newly bereaved or further along on your grief journey, what are some of the ways that you can offer that people can cope with grief? And then I think also partly with grief is the idea of blame and how we blame ourselves and others might blame us. David Kessler, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, I think just as a parent, subtly, we kind of feel like, obviously, if our kids aren't alive, something went wrong, and it might be about us. And it's fascinating to me, like literally a friend of mine said to me the other day, hey, I want some parenting advice. And I'm like, you want parenting advice from me? Like, and she's like, of course, why wouldn't I? And I'm like, well, one son didn't work out well. And she was like, that's not about you. And we need those reminders. I do tell people early on, we're going to do blame. We're going to ask those questions. And so many times when we ask the questions, what if I hadn't gone to lunch? People shut us down. Don't think that way. Sometimes we need magical thinking. We need to be able to have a conversation with someone and go, all right, can you just, like, what if I had gotten there 10 minutes earlier? And really play that out. We do that early on. And there's a point where we turn against ourselves, and that becomes our blame and our belief system. I have a lot of resources for this. It's nothing I can tell you in a moment, but 99% of the time, the blame we have as parents had nothing to do with their death. That's just across the board. And in the new book, I talk about how to do those science and understand it. I also have a free class that people can see at parentforever.com that goes into relieving some of that blame, because it is normal. We do have to question that. So, but it doesn't turn out to be true.
Sherry or David Wood?
You know, my son was a deeply troubled young man. We adopted him. He had bad things happened to him in the womb. He came to us with all kinds of challenges that, not ever having any other child, I thought all kids were like that till they grew up, and I saw that other kids weren't that kind of challenge. So it was when he died. I don't want to say that I was uniquely sensitive to my guilt, but I just had a lot of it. I had a lot of it. He was a very, very tough kid to parent, very tough kid. And it was very, very easy. It is very, very easy to think that I could have arrested the process that led to his death. And yet that's something that I've worked very, very hard on. Frankly, if there's one thing that I've worked on harder in the last 4 years than anything else, it's that. And I can't say that I've gotten to a place where I don't feel that guilt anymore, but it's different now. What it feels like is, okay, the guilt is natural. It's one of my, I don't know, you could call it a flaw, I guess, like, a gouge on a piece of antique furniture. It shows my authenticity as a parent of a very difficult child. And I just have to keep reminding myself that's the child that I was given in this universe, for whom I feel incredibly grateful. And the feelings of blame and guilt, they just kind of go with the package.
And one more thing about that, if I can. Psychologically, we'd rather, and we don't understand this on a conscious level, we'd rather feel guilty than helpless. And a death of a child is so out of our control, we try to find that little thing that if we change that, they might still be here.
And Pamela, I'd like to add to it, just because I think this particular issue is so big for so many parents. It doesn't actually matter the age of your child, the way that they died. Parents can find ways to feel guilty, even when it seems to someone on the outside that that's not even a connection to make. And I would also say for siblings, this happens as well. To what you said at first, David Kessler, I remember thinking, parents sort of have three main jobs. One is to love the heck out of your kids. The second is to provide for them. And the third is to keep them alive. So, for me, that felt like, well, one of those three failed and the other two really don't matter if you failed at that one. And for example, my son was 14. I think when they're in your home and, at least theoretically 18 and under, there's even a greater piece of that, because it's hard, no matter how they died, to not feel like, as you said, why would you even ask me advice? I couldn't keep my child alive. And I think it's fairly natural at the early stages of grief for all parents to go through that, and siblings as well. But what I learned over a little more time was, the more I held on to the blame and, beating myself up about it, the less I could get to the meaning making, the less I could get to the gratitude, the less I could feel the love, the less I could feel my son. It was just excruciating pain, which blocked the things that I want to feel more often. So it's not as if it doesn't still visit me, but I try to let it run through and let it go, because otherwise I really cannot feel all of that beautiful, all the beautiful parts that I want to take with me.
And Sherry, you mentioned in your talk about gratitude and waking up in the morning and focusing on gratitude. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And for someone who is newly bereaved, what that looked like for you in the beginning after your son first died?
Yeah, being bereaved so young in my life and watching for decades a family struggle because there wasn't the kind of support. We weren't able to, there was not a program like this. We could all listen to others who had wisdom and things to offer. I remember when Connor died, one of the things that really I felt strongly was, oh my gosh, I can't do decades of this, what I had experienced and seen and felt. there has to be a different way. And I remember hearing about gratitude, and of course, because I was a voracious reader, that was one of my ways to try to move forward. If I could just read about it, somebody must have an answer for this excruciating pain. And if I just keep reading long enough, I have a little of that control back and can find it. And my first thought of gratitude was, are you kidding me? There's nothing to be grateful for. That's just almost a mean thing to say right now. But then even in the early days, I realized, well, nothing's changing. This is what I have. So I was pretty desperate to try whatever people might suggest or whatever I would read. And for me, interestingly, one of the key things was to read, it doesn't have to be big. It can be little. Grateful can be any of the five senses, and it can be any momentary thing. So at the time, I had a dog who needed walking every day. And for me, gratitude grew because I did it while I walked. And there was something about that forward movement out in nature combined with finding something to be grateful for. And when I got outside, I could find things even more. So they were small. That might be the way that tree looked right at that moment, the way it was swishing in the wind, or the way, a waft of a scent of a flower came to me, or the way the sun was setting on the mountains. And I realized that even if I was having a horrible day and I could only come up with three things, those three things made me feel just a little bit better than when I had zero. And some days there were 3, some days there were 30 when I was walking, lots that were small, but 30 small things added up to a really different feeling than 0 and minus in the minuses. So I think it started to show me maybe there's just some other way to do this, because every day it's not changing. This is what I have. So what can I do differently to move forward in a different way?
Thank you, Sherry. A question I have for you, David Wood. If someone is on the call tonight and they are struggling with sobriety, that's something that you do a lot of talking and speaking about. Do you have some words for them tonight? Anything you'd like to share?
Sure. First and foremost, unless someone who is in the fellowship that you're in, or that the rooms you're walking into has been through what you're going through, whatever they say, whatever they express about how you're grieving is really irrelevant. Your grief is your own, and it's completely unique. And having grief go on at a time when one is trying to achieve recovery or hang on to recovery, it's just a double whammy. And I've seen it happen. My heart just goes out to people who have that extra layer of tragedy in their lives. Anybody who has gotten sober or has been through a crisis while sober, knows exactly what that pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization feels like. And losing a child is the same way. So coping with those two things isn't always, the 12-step model of recovery is sort of held out, and actually it is just this fabulous public health breakthrough in our time, but it doesn't do very well with people who are going through a horrible grief experience, because the message is, if you do the work, then everything will be fine. And that's not the way it works with grief. You do the work and things aren't fine. You do the work, things aren't fine. And then over time, and Sherry and David are really the professionals. I'm the amateur here, but from where I sit, over time, I find that the insight comes in inches and centimeters, not in units of measure longer than that. And it's not, you work the steps and you're happy, joyous, and free. It just doesn't work that way with grief. And people in the rooms don't really understand that unless they've been through it. And we need to forgive them and be there for them when they go through those horrible grief experiences, and realize that it's not that simple.
Thank you, David. And a question for anyone on the panel tonight. With this past year and the pandemic and the level of isolation that so many of us are facing, that also adds this incredible extra layer when you're grieving. If anyone would like to share maybe some ways to cope with the isolation or to cope with not having that extra support of family or friends around that you might have in other circumstances.
I would just add to that that it's so hard that we're not physically together in an isolating experience to begin with. And there's an advantage to it also. We can be in meetings we could never get to or drive to. You know, so many times people were like, what's the meeting I should go to? What's the virtual this? I remember my pain was so big, I knew like there was not one thing that was going to help me. So I say to people, go to Compassionate Friends meetings, see a counselor virtually, go to Al-Anon, go to AA, go to a suicide survivors, go to something to do with, overdoses. I've got a free Facebook group. I've got Tender Hearts if you need more support. There's so many things out there. You might not choose one, choose a lot. And just know virtually isn't as good as in person, but it's still like you can find something. Our groups, there's someone you can see 5 days a week if you need that. So I just encourage people to really go to a lot of different Compassionate Friends groups. Go to grief.com, go to Al-Anon, go everywhere you can.
Thank you, David. That's a really good point about trying out so many different things and finding the help and the support wherever you can. Sherry, do you mind, as the CEO of Compassionate Friends, do you mind sharing just a bit more about what the Compassionate Friends offers?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we have chapters that provide support in over about 550 different locations across the country. And some of those are providing virtual support right now. Some are providing hybrid, different models. When the weather was nice over the summer, some had outside. So there's certainly still support going on, and we can help connect you with that. We also have a lot of virtual support, and that even predated the pandemic. We have about 40 private Facebook groups that deal with specific types of loss and can feel very comforting. That it's a place that you can share some of your deepest feelings and thoughts and questions with others who have similar experiences. So we can connect you with those. We also have online support communities that are around the clock, where if you're feeling really in pain and in a dark place in the middle of the night, you can get up and do that. And some people find that really important. We have an annual conference each year, and we will continue to do that. Last year's had to be switched to virtual, and we'll do whatever we need to make sure that support is there, depending upon how the pandemic transpires and what we see in the future. We will have more of these kinds of events as we're able to bring people together. And as David said, it may not be as good as a hug, but it is the next best thing, especially in isolation. And then also a lot of the local chapters have their own private community Facebook groups that you can seek access to, and have their own newsletters. Reading is a wonderful way to have some support. We also have an e-newsletter you can sign up for. We have resources on our website, including our We Need Not Walk Alone magazine, which has wonderful articles from others who have walked this path. And especially for anybody newly bereaved, we have bereavement packets that we provide for free for anybody who contacts us. And it can walk you through some of the steps to find support. So there really is a lot still happening that you can access from the Compassionate Friends. So be sure you do reach out. And I just wanted to add one other kind of general tip about the isolation in particular, and that's be sure to ask others in your world for support. I know that even when we're not isolated, when the old world was here that we could seek out seeing people, we still sometimes have to ask. People don't know what we need, and we don't even have to be very specific. But if we just let people know, sometimes that text that comes even 6 months later or beyond means so much when someone remembered to do that. But they don't always know we want that or need that. And in this isolating world, it can especially help. So if you're not that able to ask because it's really new and really fresh, ask someone you know to ask others and be that messenger for you, and let people know. Texts, phone calls, just a check-in would really help you, because that's how we can feel that people are still around and there.
Can I also mention that, I mean, I know very little about women. I know a little bit more about men, and I know men, we are not good at asking for help, much less accepting help, much less, reaching out and putting our emotions on our sleeves. And, something that just breaks my heart is when I see a man going through the loss of a child whose face is like granite. And I can only imagine, because I can empathize the pain that's behind that rock face. And for me, what I found is that we men don't mature unless we go through an ordeal. That was certainly my experience. And the loss of a child is a horrible ordeal. But it's not like, the hero of the classical story going through the underworld. That ordeal has a beginning, middle, and end. Losing a child, the ordeal just changes. There's no beginning. I mean, there's a beginning, but there's no middle and end. It just changes. And I think we men have a unique opportunity to encourage each other to share our feelings more and to ask for help and accept help. And I need work on that, just like my brethren. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. The national conference, TCS, first TCS national conference I went to, I was stunned to find that the 20% of the people there were men. The other was 80% were women. I go, where are all the guys? And well, I think we men need to be there for each other on this.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, as many of you know, I work with the police department as a specialist reserve, and men do put up that armor. And when you look at men, you think they're not hurting, they're just not in pain, and it looks very different. And there's such a thing as practical grievers that are different than people who put their feelings out. And we can easily judge them and thinking what's wrong with them, and to recognize there's so many different styles of grief that are maybe different than ours.
David, that reminds me of one of my favorite quotes, is that private grief is not absent grief. And we might think if we don't see it, it's not there. And I think of that often when people aren't outwardly showing their grief. Doesn't mean they're not feeling it inside.
Right. And I always teach how grieving is on the inside, mourning is on the outside. I can't look at someone and go, she's grieving, she's crying more than she's crying, she's more hurt. I can't ever see inside anyone's grief. I can only see their acts of mourning. So we all look fine, but we all know we're not fine.
And we're going to be wrapping up our panel, but I wanted to invite each of you to share anything that you'd like to share with our group here, with our attendees. And then I'll be mentioning a few things in closing. One of the main questions we've had is whether or not a recording will be available, and it will be starting this weekend on our website. But would like to invite each of you to share a few closing thoughts, and that could be really on anything that you'd like to share with everyone. Let's see, David Wood, do you want to start? And then we'll...
Sure. For me, I have got to find, for me, the antidote to all pain is being of service to others. It's the thing that comforts me more than anything else. And when I find ways to, no matter how trivial, to be of service to those around me who are hurting as well, it just takes me out of my own head for a minute, and it allows me to open my heart in a way that helps me move down that road of processing grief that will never stop. I mean, this is going to be part of my life journey for the rest of my days on the planet. And what I aspire to is an open, grateful heart that is a function of being of service. So that's what I hope for. That's what I work toward every day, and it's the cure for me.
And David Kessler?
I want to encourage people to get support, to trust yourself, to trust your grief, to understand that grief is an organic process that you can't get wrong. And grief is about the love. If you had intense love, you're going to have intense grief. People always say, well, how long am I going to be in grief? How long is my husband, my wife, my sister going to be in grief? And I always say, well, how long is the person going to be dead? If you're going to be dead for a long time, the grief is going to be there for a long time. It doesn't always have to be pain. We can grieve in time with more love than pain, at our own pace, in our own way. And I also encourage people, if my heating and air conditioning system breaks, I get support. If my plumbing breaks, I get support. My goodness, a child dies, it's not the time to do it yourself. Get some support. It's going to look different for everyone. So please reach out to compassionate friends, to any groups, your religious organizations, wherever is for you. Grief.com, I have lots of resources. You can go to grief.com/free. I have my Tender Hearts group you can find at grief.com, a free Facebook group. The other links I mentioned were parentforever.com. If you've had a death by suicide, there's also griefsuicide.com. Those are free. I have lots of support. Don't turn away anyone for lack of funds. So no matter where you get help, you deserve it.
Thank you, David. And Sherry?
I think the one thing I'd like to add is the idea that no feelings are final. And I think that's such an important thing, because grief is the most tumultuous journey, and it takes us to lows we've often never imagined we could experience. And sometimes it takes us to highs that we never thought we could imagine. And they're all part of it. And sometimes when we're in those lows, it can truly feel like it's going to wipe us out, and there's no way we're going to get back again. And it can feel so overwhelming. And yet there is something about us and our human capacity that they move through us. And if we allow them to be felt and move through us, we can come back to a steady state. And I was reminded of this past fall with the pandemic, because we were pretty closed up here, even restaurants not open, just to see other lively human beings. And it was getting dark, and it was quiet, and the weather was changing. And I just remember some days of waves of painful grief I hadn't felt in a while. Those ones that you do feel are a tide that's going to take you away, that you won't come back from. And I just remembered, even in those moments of the toughest times, this will pass. This will pass. And usually it did. By the next day, I felt at a different place. And sometimes I felt just a little bit better than I did before I started, because I went through those. And I personally feel often that bereaved people are some of the best people I've ever met, because when you've gone down this road, you've brought meaning, and you've brought things back with you. They're just gold. No one would ask for it. We'd all give it back if we could. But when we do that, different types of human beings are created that are really, really special in this world. And that's where we find that meaning from those experiences. So especially if you're newly in grief, they don't stay. You continue to evolve and become something else.
Thank you so much, Sherry and David, for being here with us tonight and for your talks that were so comforting. And we've had so many more questions than we're able to answer tonight, but we so appreciate all of you being here with us. And again, the recording will be available on our website. If you'd like to learn more about the Compassionate Friends or to support TCF through a donation or in any other way, you can visit us at compassionatefriends.org. We can also be reached by email at nationaloffice@compassionatefriends.org. And we hope that all of you have a peaceful evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.